This morning, in our gospel reading, we hear again that well-known occasion of the feeding of the 5,000. Actually, it's the feeding of the 5,000 plus. It's an example of God's gracious love, his abounding generosity in providing not only what was needed, but far too much. 12 baskets were left over. But this account in Matthew's Gospel doesn't sit in isolation as we heard it this morning. It isn't a chapter on its own. It isn't even the whole of the story. It's part of a wider story that we ought to know. We get a clue that it is part of a wider story in the first verse that we read, because the feeding of the 5,000 comes after the account of the murder of John the Baptist. Beheaded in prison on the whim of an unjust ruler and the scheming of his wife, Jesus hears of this murder and wishes to spend time alone, to grieve, to pray, to come to terms with what has happened and what it might mean going forward for him and his ministry. But the crowds follow him. They find him in the wilderness, and they bring their needs to Jesus. He has compassion for them and heals the sick. And then in the evening, the disciples come to Jesus and say, "You need to send these people away. It's getting late. They need to go and get food for themselves." And Jesus says a rather strange thing. They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. What a ridiculous thing to suggest. Over 5,000 people milling around, hungry. And Jesus is suggesting that the disciples feed them all with what? 5 loaves and 2 fish? Yes. Bring them to me, Jesus says. Bring what you've got. And he gives God thanks for the resources that have been given, however small it may seem. And then he tells the disciples to distribute. And that little goes far further than it would be possible to believe. I have read commentaries on Matthew's Gospel that suggest that not everyone ate the 5 loaves and 2 fish that were brought to Jesus. It's been suggested that people in the crowd saw the attitude of generosity and sharing and took out what food they had and brought and shared that with those that were seated by them. I don't know about that. The Bible doesn't say that. But that sounds like just as much of a miracle if that was how it happened. To get people to share food when they themselves are hungry and they've brought enough food for themselves, well, that's not a natural human reaction. I guess it might be possible. And if it did happen that way, then I can't think of a reason why the gospel writers wouldn't have put those details in. But whatever the practical mechanics, Jesus performed a miracle that day. Small resources were given to him, and through God's blessing, they achieved the miracle of feeding over 5,000 people. But as I said, this story doesn't sit in isolation. Before it is the murder of John the Baptist. After it is the telling of Jesus walking on the water, coming to the disciples on the lake and their lack of faith. Now, which is more of a miracle? Feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, or walking on a lake? I'd suggest that both miracles would blow our minds. And if I were sitting on the fence about whether to believe in Jesus at the beginning of the day, my mind would have been made up after seeing 5,000 plus people fed with so little. The second would be surprising, watching Jesus walk on the lake, but it would be more of a, wow, look at Jesus, he's at it again. Is there anything he can't do? I don't think I'd have any doubts after seeing all those people go home full and having then the problem of what to do with the leftovers. What do you do with 12 baskets of broken bread? Feeds a lot of pigeons. But saying all that, there are times when my faith hasn't been strong. There are times that I've behaved as though I've got to do everything, that I've not trusted in God and his favour. So I'm not going to be too hard on those disciples in a boat on a stormy lake. Yesterday, many of you will have received an email containing a letter written by myself, Canon Lisa and Reverend Rebecca, the clergy of our parish of Horsham, informing you about the financial difficulties we find ourselves in because of COVID and the lack of income over the past months. If you get the notice sheet by hard copy, that letter will be coming out to you with next week's newsletter. And we've lost income over the past months, particularly from church hall hires and occasions like weddings and concerts, which haven't been able to take place. The shortfall is in the region of £42,000 that we anticipate to be this year. I said that rather quickly because it's a big number. It's an anticipated number of 42,000 because we don't know how long the COVID restrictions will continue for, or, as has happened this week, whether they will become stricter for a time, meaning that the music recitals that were planned for St Mary's in September have this week had to be postponed. Now, 2020 has been a difficult time for all of us, and a difficult time for a lot of people financially. And we are not asking everyone to reach into already empty pockets to help the parish. But there are some of us who have made savings too. Those who might regularly eat out and have not had that opportunity might be one example. What we are doing is asking everyone to look at our circumstances. And we're informing you of the circumstances of the parish, asking if each one of us can do anything to help with a one-off gift. The parish itself has also looked at its finances. St Mary's particularly have looked seriously at the staff it employs and has asked whether they as a church can realistically afford all those roles in the same way that they were before COVID as they look to move forward. We've also looked at other ways of reducing that £42,000 shortfall, including taking money out of the church's fabric funds and the small reserves that we hold as a parish. But that would mean that our buildings wouldn't necessarily have work done on them that is needed. At Holy Trinity, we are already struggling to find out how we might financially meet the renewing of the church hall floor, which has come to the end of its life and now needs to be completely renewed. We also have a church inspection in September, where our architect will take a look at all aspects of the church building and tell us what we need to do to maintain and preserve the structure. And we haven't quite yet completed all that he told us to do 5 years ago due to financial constraints. Our fine organ was repaired and replaced last week. Sounds a lot better than it did the previous week. It's now been retuned and it's now in a state that it will last a good while longer. We'll be playing for hopefully many years to come, to the appreciation of congregations and concert attendees alike. And this is before we start on the more important aspects of church life, like the running of Messy Church, which is financially self-supporting, but needs the church and the hall to be in a good state of repair for the 130, 150 so people that come through for their activities. And then there's the many community groups and functions that are held within our buildings. The work that we undertake with young people through our groups and through the choir, along with the simple costs of worship, electricity, gas for the heating in the winter, candles, paper. As you can imagine, the list goes on. And so we're asking for help. But we need to remember the lesson of our gospel this morning. 5 loaves and 2 small fish. Not a lot of resources, yet over 5,000 were fed. And we have an example from within our own church family too of the goodness of God's graciousness. Jane and the TCP sewers, with leftover and donated fabric and lengths of elastic, have produced face masks, some of which I see before me this morning. It's a small thing, but it was something that was needed by our community. And the face masks weren't priced. All that was asked for was a donation. And who would have thought that, well, at the time the notice sheet was put together this week, there was over 900 face masks have been made, and donations totalling £3,600 has been given. That's amazing. I would say that's a miracle, because that's what happens when we use our resources, no matter how small, and we use those resources to serve God by serving our neighbour and our community. If you've an allotment that you've been tending during COVID and you've got extra fruit and vegetables, you could display them outside your home, invite people to give a donation for what they might take, and then give that money to our COVID recovery appeal. Could you offer the resource of crafting skills to produce something? I'm trying to hand carve a wooden angel, which I would sell to help the COVID recovery appeal. It takes about a day to carve an angel. Could I give that time and make, I don't know, about £5 an angel towards the COVID recovery appeal? Well, £5 for a day's work, it's not a lot. Maybe I won't bother. And what would have happened if the disciples had said, we've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish, let's not bother? There are many ways of giving, and we shouldn't be discouraged about how little we may have to give. £5 for a day's work. Well, let's give that and see what God can do with that money by serving our community. Not many of us could think of donated £3,600 from face masks, but that shouldn't stop us doing our bit with the resources that we have. And if you had asked Jane, when she first got the idea of making face masks, what would be an amazing total? What do you think you would be blown away by making from the face masks? Well, I remember how excited she got when we were close to £1,000 for the face masks. Could she have imagined making £1,500 from face masks? But that's been more than doubled. Through God's grace and the work of those sowers giving their time and resources, not all of them are members of Holy Trinity Church, but they are more than happy to support us in helping to support our community. The COVID recovery appeal asks for a one-off gift. And if you have the ability to do that, then a gift, no matter how small, will be greatly appreciated, because every small bit assists, to misquote a popular slogan. But more generally, our gospel reading today invites us to look at all the resources that we've been given. Our time, our energy, our gifts, our skills, our finances, our hobbies, our interests, and to see ways in which we can offer them to God's service, to do good. Not to be worried or cautious about how small they may seem, because God is good all the time, and his blessing poured over our meagre offerings can make a real difference in the lives of people around us. You don't believe me? Well, just ask over 5,000 who ate whether 5 loaves and 2 fish made a difference to their hunger that day. Ask over 900 people whether donated offcuts and pieces of elastic make a difference in their lives as they go shopping around the community today. And in the offertory prayer that echoes 1 Chronicles chapter 29, we sometimes use it in our Eucharist, and we say, "Yours, Lord, is the greatness, the power, the glory, the splendour and the majesty. For everything in heaven and on earth is yours. All things come from you, and of your own do we give you. May I ask each and every one of us to prayerfully consider our response to our COVID recovery appeal. Amen.